Welcome to another Spotlight session. And today we're joined by Carol Sanford. And if you don't mind, Carol, I'm going to run through a bit of introduction of you because you have an incredible background. So Carol is an award-winning author, Contrarian thought leader, regenerative paradigm educator, which we are going to talk about as well. And Carol also hosts the Business Second Opinion podcast. So Carol, first of all, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Martin.
Fantastic. And Carol, we share more in common than what we realized before we started. When we met, you have actually the same name as my mother.
Right.
Yeah.
Which means song, right?
Yes.
So your mother and I are both about singing.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, my mother has a gorgeous voice, actually, and she does enjoy singing as well. And so, Carol, the other thing too that I'd like to share with our audience is you've got a new book coming out.
Yeah.
So, and the name of the book is Indirect Work, and it focuses on regenerative theory of change of business, institutions, communities, and humans. So with that, Carol, I'd love for you to give an extended introduction of yourself to our audience.
Oh, my goodness. Well, one of my favorite things that I get to do is I'm a senior fellow for Babson College for social innovation. And it means I get to work with faculty and members of their institutes, less with students. And I also am starting a new YouTube channel, but I'll get back to you because I'm learning a steep learning curve. I do have 6 books as of January when the one you just announced is out. And I run 2 communities, one for business teams, meaning those who run the business together, not always a hierarchy, and change agent teams. And those people hang out with me for decades. I've got people who've been members for 40 years.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, yeah. And I and thank you for the decade thing is interesting because I'm just doing an introduction to the podcast, Next Gen Leaders. And it talks about how do we get to learn from the past and the present, and then how do we look at the future as well? Because I think we can bring all of that together to help everyone move forward, one together, but also in a positive way as well. Yeah. Now, I would also like to, we're going to get into some really incredible topics like, you and I have talked about paradigm shift. We've talked about what's new inside teams. We even started to touch on climate change. Right, and getting everyone on the same page of how we can do that as leaders. But what I'd love to answer first, because I get a real energy from you. What are some of your passions?
So you know what I'm going to say about this, which is passion comes from the same root word as pain. Literally, they have the same derivation. Yeah. And so I refuse to be passionate about anything. What I do is I care about how it is you grow whole humans. My 5th book was about the regenerative life, which was how does every individual learn how to grow their own and others' capacity and quit trying to use behavioral change to modify other people. Yes. So that's a subject I care about. I want whole businesses to learn to redesign themselves because the way business is designed right now is based on at least 400-year-old science of Newton and physics, like that was it. But it also is based on the ruling of kings and queens and all the steps down, and the Catholic Church, where you get to have one person on top and then layers. So those are subjects I care a lot about. And then, of course, you mentioned climate change. I throw into their racism and conflict, all of those things. I'm doing a summit on December 8th to try and give people a way to see there's one thing that underlies all of those and why we can't move it forward. Yeah.
Now, you really hit me between the eyes when you responded to passion initially when we were talking earlier. So thank you very much for grabbing hold of that.
You're very welcome.
And it was brilliant to hear it. You just got fresh eye. The way you think is just so, yes, there's a lot of history there and there's a lot of experience, but the way you're thinking is ahead where we are today. It really is where we are today. And so when the next person says, "Hey, Martin, I love this about you. You're passionate," I'm going to go, I'm not passionate.
You're right.
What so paradigm shifts.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. What does it mean to a leader? Let's think about the leadership model right now.
Well, we hear that term and have for decades. People say we ought to shift paradigms if we're going to have a world that works and companies that work. But I think most people don't really know what it means. I worked with Thomas Kuhn at UC Berkeley as an undergraduate when he was visiting there. And he said that we are actually shifting how we see the world, not changing what we do, because we will change what we do if we can change the mind. So let me give you an example of what I see as the 4 paradigms that work in our world right now. The bottom line one is more the machine view, and it's all about humans are interchangeable parts. We still have 80% of the companies on the planet treat people as machine, computer, clocks. That is a worldview, and it puts authoritarian processes in place.
Yes.
And ways of treating people, which we all know is not appropriate, and all the way to in some countries where it's really it kills people, but it kills spirit everywhere. The second paradigm will lead us a bit into how we try and create change, which is what I call arrest disorder, which means we see that extract value machine paradigm. We say, we got to stop that. We got to do less harm. We're tearing up the earth by strip mining, by the way we take minerals out of the ground. We're even doing it with the way we have democracy works. Let's do less bad, less harm. And of course, I started 40 years ago using the example of, to do that is like saying beat your children less, or beat your wife less. You know, you can't get there from trying to do less of the bad stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
In the last 3 or 4 years, I've heard people telling my story about that and starting to say, well, we don't want to do just less bad. We want to do good.
Yes.
Now, that sounds great, right? Don't you get excited? Yeah, let's do good. Well, no, actually, do good is an ideological, anthropocentric way of trying to change the world. I think the world should be like this. So I'm going to influence people. I'm going to be a philanthropist. I'm going to colonize. I mean, you know, the whole history of colonization, because your life has been surrounded by it.
Absolutely.
And I worked a lot in South Africa too. But the do good is not a good thing, because it always means projection of one worldview onto other people without necessarily their permission. The worldview and the paradigm shift I'm talking about is going from away from this extract value, away from doing less harm, away from doing good, into understanding how living systems work. We don't bother to do that. We study based in all of our school classes, wherever you are, not only the Western world anymore, it's everywhere, but it's all about fragmentation. You chop everything up, like you learn science by chopping up a frog, cut its legs off, pin them on a board, put names, and then you think you can understand the working of frog. You can't understand the working of frog by looking at parts. So you have to get into a place where frogs live and jump. But I spend a lot of time teaching people how to do that, and I call that regenerative thinking. So there's a quick overview of how I think about paradigms.
Well, and that's incredible. And I think we could talk about frogs for a while, is my sense as well. So I want to think about, you said something earlier, which I want to keep moving with this theme of the paradigm shift and looking at what's new. And when we talked about leadership, we started to talk about what's new in teams. So I'd love to hear from you in relation to how you're thinking about how the world looks forward, and how we actually help team leaders and leaders move their teams effectively forward.
Well, one of the problems we have with teams is they are attempts at ameliorating something that doesn't work.
Mhm.
So, for example, people end up doing cross-functional teams.
Mhm.
Well, why in the world are we having to cross-functional? Because we organized around functions and have people in a box doing their set of work, handing it off to somebody else, hardly knowing what it affects and having their own internal measures.
Yes.
That structuring of teams as an ameliorating factor is a problem. So 45 years ago, and a few of my colleagues longer than me who are long dead now, reconceived of teams as not internally organized,
Yes.
but externally wrapped around the outside world they serve.
Yeah,
So
right.
there are no, well, there are people who will run an assembly line or coding group, and they'll be doing that work, but their primary team is a market team they are on in addition to their daily work. So let me give you an example. Merida Meridian, which is a small but booming small company which does sustainable textiles and fair trade and all those wonderful kind of things. They were originally wrapped around looms and shipping and design. And instead, we went and looked at who are the primary buyers and users, which are interior designers, hotels, who are the primary differentiated buyers. And we found 5 of them. I'm not going to give you all of them. I'll give you one as an example. One of them was the bespoke community, people who wanted, as an interior designer, have their name on things, have it look like it came from them and not the brand that made it. That organization, we took probably, and we invited who would like to become an expert, a champion for the bespoke buyers for us.
Yes.
And there was a member distribution across the organization as a whole. They meet, I mean, in Merida Meridian, I think it's more like every 6 weeks now. But they meet and they all bring information about what's going on in the world of the bespoke designers. And then they go back to their production team or their design team or their marketing where they have to do some work. But they bring that perspective, and their primary team is their market field team, the team and they end up being part of the strategy. They end up having individuals who commit to do things for in the name of that team or on their own for a particular buyer. So regeneration, the paradigm shift here, is about going from internal, about how we measure and do work, to externally organizing teams. And all measures go from being internal output, what our goals are, our numbers, to what it is the customer, the interior designers are measuring. And when you do that and you have teams carry that back into the organization, work looks very different. That's real teaming.
Yeah, I love that. I love it for 2 reasons. One, because it's so true in what you're saying, right? And we do lose sight of it. And the amount of organizations that are continue to work in silos. And then question, well, why aren't I achieving what I set out to achieve? Why don't I have this fantastic culture? It's because you've taken traditional frameworks and you've just put it into play.
Well, we compound that. Let me add a little. We compound that with another amelioration, which is we now set up standardized competencies. Everybody has to have. Even, which is ridiculous. People aren't the same. We also have rewards and recognition where we try and manipulate them and move them so everybody's doing what they ought to do. My book, The Regenerative Business, book number 3, talks about 30 toxic practices, and there's 105, but I couldn't put them all in the book. So 30, which one of
you got 3 more books then.
I have 2 others printed after that, but they change subjects a little. They're all about regeneration, but the nature of how we structure not only teams in a crazy way, but work in a crazy way, doesn't really work well because you got people being judged by someone else. And that's the opposite here. Let me see if I can say this. What we're doing right now is structuring teams around internal thinking, but we want to change people based on external input to those teams. Managers, higher ups, philosophers, psychologists evaluate teams all the time. They don't evaluate themselves. And so we have structured so many stupid, ridiculous practices from reward and recognition, which was, by the way, came about because of the study of rats. So if you're a leader who manages rats, behavioral management is your gig. That should be your what do they call it? Your jam. But if you don't manage rats or gorillas or something that's been studied to come up with behavioralism, then you are working with a 400-year-old paradigm, and we'll come back to this at some point. It's like being a billiard ball table player, where you see those balls on the table are the people who work for me. Or if it's climate change, it's the people who we need to change out there. And I know what pocket they should be in. Okay, get an image. The pocket where these people who work for me ought to be this core competency, that behavior, that reporting. And now I'm the cue stick manager, right? And I back up and I hit the cue ball toward the pocket. Why in the world would we manage that way? And that's what Einstein says Newton taught us to do. You have to look at in teams and humans as individual, all who, if you create a different work design, they can initiate. And I know this because I've done it for 45 years, 150 plus companies. And you get rid of all those manipulating billiard ball table management. So that's another thing that would change. Teams would do their own initiative, their own passion, right? But mostly what the work was that their buyers, their users needed. I don't know. Is this making any sense?
No, it absolutely is. Well, the internal and the external element of what you're talking about we lose so much sight when we're so internal. Right. Whether it's historical structures and the other reason why I was going, and I nearly slipped and said passion, but the other reason why I'm really engaged with what you're saying, because when we looked at stratapp has a lot of those philosophical views that you're talking about. It was breaking down all notion of what a traditional organization looks like. And it was, how do we now bring everyone around the common themes, where we said, sure, we want to go here, but how are we going to get there? Great.
Right.
What are we going to do? And that included internal and external stakeholders.
Right. Well, I don't believe there is any such thing as internal stakeholders.
Right.
There's no division. Well, there's neither one. There's neither external. That's an artificial divide. What you want is a value adding process view from something coming from Earth, the soil, the food produced, the ideas that moves along a stream, and it passes through some suppliers and manufacturers and then distributors and into the life of users. You want everyone in that value adding flow to think about the life of people who are going to use it. Now you have nothing internal and external. That's like the frog being cut up. What you have is people imaging, making people's lives work, and they get to add value, and then the next one adds value, but they're all in it together. It's one whole. So our biggest problem paradigm is all this chopping things up like frog legs.
No, I agree. And it's so, well, let me ask you this then. If 80% of I don't know if it was 80% of companies, leaders, but 80% of organizations, institutions are still following the traditional flow.
Right. The machine view.
Why is that? Is that who we are as humans?
No. The reason is we don't understand our work as leaders, whether that's of an educational institution, a business, a family, is about changing the paradigm of life being about what human capacity is. So in the indirect work title is talking about we have to work indirectly in order to change all this. The more direct we are, the more we make it worse. We're the cue ball, right? Direct, hit that damn cue ball, make it go in that pocket. Indirect is what's missing, which is building capability to think systemically. That's why my companies can have no hierarchies that are artificially constructed, no reward and recognition, no people managing all the other people, because everyone has capability to think in a value-adding process view of where everything works. The second thing, so capability we don't build. And that is the future role of all leaders, not managing people, not managing resources. They can do that. It is building capability to think systemically. I structure it so supervisors switch from supervising people to supervising the development of thinking capacity. All this is in the regenerative business. So I'm not going to get a depth here. Secondly, it's about building culture. We don't have cultures which have built-in rituals and beliefs that every person should be in a developmental process weekly, monthly, where this is what I do when I go into a business. I don't go in and give them a template. I tell stories like this, but I'm building capability of people to think and building their capability to think about what culture they want. And you don't do culture, you create a way of being. And the third thing we don't do, and why we're staying stuck in this 80%, it's probably worse than that. I'm trying to be gracious, right? The third thing is conscious. And me, gracious, I know you were laughing.
You were very kind because I was thinking higher.
Okay. Consciousness is the third thing. And consciousness is a very practical skill. You know, we think of it as navel gazing or something like woo-woo. It's not. We have the capacity undeveloped, completely undeveloped in our school, in our families, in our businesses, to be mindful of what our mind is doing. I mean, what I'm calling you out on, and you're laughing, it's I'm catching you in unconscious thought. You got words coming out of your mouth you aren't thinking about. Sorry, you're here in front of me, so I get to use an example. You don't think about what that means, and you don't know. But if you have teams which are being developed all the time to learn to set an aim for their own growth, like my aim is never do anything the same way twice. That's my life. I 35 years ago figured out that would make a difference. It would drive me to get smarter every day. So I'm trying even today to come up with new ways of presenting it. And I've gotten a couple in here and I'm very excited. And if I do that and I'm teaching, I never give the same presentation. I don't do the same workshop. That's a fundamental kind of consciousness evoking process. I have to think about this audience, like we started with. Who listens to this, Martin? You said, well, leaders, you know, and leaders inside organizations, other kind of organizations, even owning their own company. Well, if that's the case, we have to design this conversation for them. And I have to design it with you. And then I have to manage me, because I'd rather be lazy. Can't I just tell you something I already know? And, you know, I just recite it. No, we have to teach people to work on themselves so that they can actually bring what's needed for what's in front of them.
No, I there's a lot of things you and I can continue to talk about, but I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna stop, because there was one thing I'd like to actually talk about that we covered off. You talked about the summit that you're doing. You talked about climate. Excuse me. And the other thing you actually talked about was international tribal conflict. There was some really deep things that you were sort of referencing. But on the climate side, what are you doing there, and what are your thoughts there?
So I'm working on 3 things at one time. You just fragmented them. I'm going to put them back together because you care about climate change, and that's great. So do I. But what we're doing in the summit is going back to what is the underpinning that causes all 3 of those to get worse. We now know that, for example, a majority in every Western world, the only place we have research, believes that believes that climate change is real, that humans are affecting, and we have to do something. So we have an increasing number of people who believe that. We have a non-return on shifting people and how they take things on. Why is that? The same thing is true of racism. We have actually fewer racist acts, but more, we have people who, if you ask them, what do you think about racist behavior? And they'll say, well, it's wrong, and really mean it. I mean, not just, and yet we have more violence around racism. So that's not getting better. Same thing is true. And by tribes, there are many different kinds we'll talk about. And that term's been kind of banalized, but we want to belong. And so we will organize ourselves in cliques, right? We would have called them in high school, or groupings or tribes where we feel like, oh, this is my group. All right. So the same thing underlies all 3 of those. And what we're going to do at the summit is look at how something I've hinted at here a couple of times is driving all of it, which is fragmentation and seeing the world as things. So we have to talk a little bit about our friend, Mr. Newton, the scientist who created classical physics. And what he said was, everything is a thing. Nothing can move you unless you hit it and keep hitting it. And so we have translated the whole world to a billiard ball table. And until people understand quantum physics, and I'm not a physicist, but I've hung out with a few, and understand that it's a matrix, like the movie, and like the womb in which a baby's held, it's everything that's surrounding it. And if we can learn to see wholes instead of fragments, we have to change it. We can no longer have in school systems subjects like math is separate from art, is separate from play. Is all of that is fragmenting. We create racial divides that act as though race it really exists. It's a construct of social and political. It has, you can't do real genetic work. The genetics will tell you, nope, you can't determine race. Same thing is true on climate change. We get a list of 17 United Nations goals as though they're independent and fragmented from one another. So what do we need to do instead? We need to work with wholes. So if we're going to do climate change, every place within a life shed, and I don't call them watersheds because that's an anthropocentric term. It's our water comes from there. Let's call it a watershed, our water. No, it's a life shed where there's air, water, biota, fish, bears, and we work with what makes the whole healthy. And if we do the same thing with any city or neighborhood, we can work with as a whole versus I sit on the board of a philanthropic organization who our only challenge is to stop the piecemeal funding of philanthropists into locations where everybody's working on a piece and asking them to do it our way. We destroy the ability of people to see how living systems work. So we're going to talk about how you design a company, which I've been doing for 45 years, but we're going to work on that on the summit. And how you, if you shift this constant working with pieces and parts like rivers separate from shipping, I mean, the list goes on, but you can redesign work. And that's what I call a regenerative business. And it's not working on any of those parts, none of them. It never actually, I never talk about global climate change, but I introduced to people how you could rethink the way you run your mining company. And if you did, you could actually improve the health and vitality of your workers, the life shed you're a part of, which includes all the rivers and everything in it.
Yeah.
And I've done that with DuPont, and it ended up being able to reduce by 90% the destruction they were doing, and then begin to shift and grow. Because we're never going to stop mining everything.
Yes.
Because we all use it. But if we think of that as a part of a life shed, you do it very, very differently. So we have to give up fragmentation and start from wholes that are living.
Yes. Yeah. I love it. I love it. And my sense is we could turn this into a 2-hour session between you and I, because the other thing too, when we first met, the humor and the comedy was just flowing off the
I used to be a stand-up comedian. Did I?
Did you?
That? I did on North Beach in San Francisco. I also was in improvisational theater.
Yes.
That was my young years.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'll share with you. You are actually the second stand-up comedian we've had on the show. Yeah.
Right.
So
it's
Stephen
good
Hoskins.
Training.
Yeah.
That everyone should do improvisational theater training and stand-up comedy.
Yes.
Stand-up comedy helps you see the world from a humorous position, and you don't take it quite as seriously.
Yes.
But improvisational theater keeps you in the moment.
Yes.
Present and knowing how to be thinking about what's actually happening there, not what's in your mind you want to get across to someone.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And it's interesting you say it, because you can see when you converse with people, you can see where they're so natural in flow. And I remember Stephen, I was sort of working with Stephen, and I've seen the work he does. I've been in his shows. And then when we get working together, the creativity side of it is just so amazing. The energy, right? The energy behind it is just so amazing, because the thoughts are never ending. Right?
Never do anything the same way twice.
Yeah.
That is what creativity and innovation means, but it means we have to overcome our mechanicalness of we have an answer. We're going to project on this situation, this person, influence them, get them to think what we do, sell what we do. No, we have to come be present with each other, and we can't see it. I'm relating to you as a whole being.
Yes.
Not as somebody who can market me. Please,
okay, I got my t-shirt and everything on.
Exactly.
My Batman t-shirt is here. No, that's fantastic. So, Carol, if you don't mind, then I'm going to do a plug for you. So the new book's out in January.
Yeah.
Indirect Work, Regenerative Theory of Change for Business, Institution, Communities, and Humans. As well. So, Carol, thank you very much for joining Spotlight. You've regenerated me and invigorated me for a amazing Saturday here in Australia. And
you regenerated yourself. No one can ever do that for you. I can come be present with you, regenerate my thinking in the present moment, and we both will have that experience.
I love it. I love it, Carol. Thank you very much for joining Spotlight.
My pleasure.
Take care.
Take risk.
Bye.